Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a very interesting poem. This one is called To a Foiled European Revolutionaire. It's interesting that the word revolutionaire doesn't get used in the poem and never gets used anywhere else in all of Leaves of Grass. We'll be talking about this poem number 7 of the 38 of Autumn Rivulets. Just to remind, we've commented that autumn designates or symbolizes old and rivulets represents new. So we're definitely going to be playing around with those ideas for sure in a poem like this. Now, this is a continuation of what we have called Leaves of Grass to be a sustained theodicy. Namely, the question is, why must terrible things happen? Notice the use of the word here, foiled, which will take us back to Centenarian's story as well as a march in the ranks, both from the drum tap section. That is to say, what do you do when there's failure? Failed revolutions or whatever. But how do you deal with failure? That's going to be this question of a sustained theodicy. And we'll get to it. As we've already said, Whitman's theodicy is simple. No longer ask when bad things happen, why did this happen to me? But rather, why did this happen for me? In other words, don't see yourself as a victim, but rather as somebody in control. Certainly that will also be true not only for us as individuals, but as groups. And the sociological theodicy, we've been talking about it quite at length in our study of Leaves of Grass. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, and down that left-hand side, that is to say, our discussion with the words right from the very beginning with inscriptions, up to and including a set of introductory comments for Autumn Rivulets. We just finished with this compost. Now, our Nortons will tell us about this interesting little poem that when first published in Leaves of Grass 1856 with several of its lines transferred from the 1855 preface, as we've seen in several other poems already. This poem had the flamboyant title, quote, Liberty Poem for Asia, Africa, Europe, America, Australia, Cuba, and the Archipelagos of the Sea, end quote. In 1860 and 67 it became To a Foiled Revolter or Revoltress, and in 1871 it took its present title. It is evident that the poet meant, as he added in the 1871, to be the voice of, quote, every dauntless rebel the world over, end quote. The text was much revised in Leaves of Grass editions from 1860 to 1871. In the 5th and 6th editions of 1871-76, this poem was one of the 6 placed in a special group called Songs of Insurrection, a division not retained in later editions. So with that, with that being said, obviously we're dealing with a poem that has to do with radical kinds of views, with failure of those rebels and the like. Now, the poem is in many ways constructed as a speech, so I would pay attention to that. Also, I would like to point out that grass continues to be that powerful symbol. Nature's cycles, that whole notion of regeneration will be playing around here. I want to take us to a couple of moments earlier on in Leaves of Grass. Hey, do you remember in Europe the 77th and 73rd years of these states when we played around with that? Do you remember this? The question is about corpses of young men. Those corpses of young men, those martyrs that hang from the gibbets, those hearts pierced by the gray lead, cold and motionless as they seem, live elsewhere with unslaughtered vitality. They live in other young men, O kings. They live in brothers again, ready to defy you. They were purified by death. They were taught and exalted. And then, of course, the lines that will be specific to this poem. Not a grave of the murdered for freedom, but grows seed for freedom in its turn to bear seed, which the winds carry afar and resow, obviously a tipping of your hat to Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, and the rains and snows nourish. That is to say, we're going to see something very similar here. And you remember this from passage 14 of Song of the Open Road, Allons, let's go. Through struggles and wars, the goal that was named cannot be countermanded. Have the past struggles succeeded? What has succeeded? Yourself, your nation, nature? Now understand me well, it's provided in the essence of things that from any fruition of success, no matter what, shall come for something to make a greater struggle necessary. My call is the call of battle. I nourish active rebellion. He going with me must go well armed. He going with me goes often with spare diet, poverty, angry enemies, desertions. In other words, failure. And to that degree, we're playing around obviously with the great 1848 year, the year of revolutions as it's sometimes referred to. Obviously, there's going to be all kinds of challenges about this poem. By the way, in the original poem, if you want to run into ground, you have a number of references to slavery which happen here, which of course makes this a fascinating poem to read, because as we're going to ask at the conclusion of the reading of this poem, what are we going to say to those of the South, the Confederacy? It was it not a foiled revolution? Yeah? So what are you going to say to those kinds of individuals? Well, this poem, I think, is going to be a bit ambiguous about some of those questions. Notice we'll begin with the word courage, and you'll remember this from No Labor Saving Machine. Courage yet, my brother or my sister. It's interesting that both brother and sister is used here. It's also interesting that notice camarero is not going to get used, comrade is not going to use it's here, brother or sister. Keep on. That is to say, Song of the Open Road, passage 9. You'll remember that use there. And then the dash. Liberty, capital L. Liberty is to be subserved whatever occurs. In other words, no matter what happens in a theodicy of this nature, we're always going to try and see beyond the failure. That is nothing that is quelled by one or two failures, or any number of failures, or by the indifference or ingratitude of the people, or by any unfaithfulness or the show of the tusks of power, that is to say the tusks or the teeth of power, soldiers, cannon, penal statutes. So notice right away. In other words, just because it's failed doesn't mean that it's over. Okay? What we believe in, notice the plural, what we believe in waits latent forever through all the continents. This idea of latent growth, obviously leaves of grass, right? Invites, back to the original very first word of leaves of grass, come. Invites no one, promises nothing, sits in calmness and light, is positive and composed, knows no discouragement. Waiting patiently, waiting its time. It takes us back to, of course, our study of Longfellow's Psalm of Life, and those final lines, let us then be up and doing with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait, that idea of patience. And then in parenthetics, and we've seen this in Leaves of Grass so regularly, notice here, not songs of loyalty alone are these. So notice we start with courage, now we go to loyalty. But songs of insurrection also. You'll remember this still, though, the one I sing, O latent right of insurrection. You'll remember this use of the word insurrection also. For I am the sworn poet of every dauntless rebel the world over. You'll remember dauntless from Over the Carnage. Dauntless rebel the world over, and he going with me. We're back again to Song of the Open Road, passage 14. And he going with me leaves peace and routine behind him, and stakes his life to be lost at any moment. In other words, the idea of count the cost, and the willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. This takes us obviously back to the study of drum taps. And speaking of drum taps, look at the next words, the battle. And we got 7 of these, right? So you'll see it. That will then be finished up with the word but. The battle rages with many a loud alarm, and frequent advance and retreat. In other words, that's the nature of battle. The infidel, this will take us back to Song of Myself, passage 22, and we're going to see this infidel several times. The infidel triumphs, or supposes he triumphs, the prison, scaffold, the use of this word garrote, that is to say strangulation device, garrote, handcuffs, iron necklace, lead balls, do their work. In other words, if you are a revolutionary, you're going to be punished. You maybe even will be executed. The named and unnamed heroes, he loves this word, right, pass to other spheres. The great speakers and writers are exiled. They lie sick in distant lands. The cause is asleep. By the way, this is the only use in all Leaves of Grass in this way of the word, of the phrase, the cause. The cause is asleep. The strongest throats are choked with their own blood. It's powerful imagery. The young men droop their eyelashes toward the ground when they meet. That is to say, resignation because of failure. But, and again, all of that to lead to the word but. But, for all this, liberty, notice again capitalized, has not gone out of the place, nor the infidel entered into full possession. When liberty goes out of a place, it is not the first to go, nor the second or third to go. It waits for all the rest to go. It is the last. It's interesting the way Whitman decides to use exclamation points in Leaves of Grass. It's interesting when he doesn't. For example, I've had readers that ask, why wouldn't he put an exclamation part here? Obviously, this is to be understood as almost like shouting as it's being said. In other words, liberty will always endure. It cannot be killed. When and then is the next construction. Study it. When there are no more memories of heroes and martyrs, when all life and all the souls of men and women are discharged from any part of the earth, then only shall liberty, or the idea of liberty, be discharged from that part of the earth, and the infidel come into full possession. Now, his use of this word infidel is fascinating because obviously it's a somewhat Christian word and his readers would know what that word means, but to what degree are we comfortable using that word in reference to, for example, all people who are involved in revolutions of the like that will maybe be on the opposite side, the side of power, obviously, is the infidel. Then, now to finish, courage, European revolter. Notice revoltress. That is to say, this is really moving us towards, as I've already said to you guys a number of times, Whitman as from American poet to world poet. And when we hit finally Passage to India, we will come full circle in lines like this. We'll know exactly where he is. By the way, notice courage, we're back to the original word of the poem. Then courage, European revolter, revoltress. Again, brother, sister. For till all ceases, neither must you cease. You'll remember, back to Song of Myself, passage 1, hoping to cease not till death. In other words, there's a way to read Leaves of Grass as a call to, again, revolution, insurrection, all of those kind of irreverent words, back to Song of Myself 14. I do not know, and interesting epistemologically now, I do not know what you are for. I do not, in parenthetics now, I do not know what I am for myself, nor what anything is for. In other words, teleos. It's not always clear what one is actually for and what the point of a revolution might be. But, you knew that word was coming. I will search, that is to say, this all about curious, right? I will search carefully for it, the end, the point, even in being foiled. And there's your theodicy. No longer ask, why did this happen to us, but rather, why did this happen for us? In defeat, we're going to get now lists here to end this poem. In defeat, poverty, misconception, imprisonment. I mean, think about Henry David Thoreau and the one night he spent in jail that would produce Civil Disobedience of 1849. The year before that, of course, is Marx Engels with Communist Manifesto in 1848. It's a fascinating time or window of time to be thinking about the whole notion of revolution and the like, right? Or the disobedience of any number of kinds. Notice the dash. For they too are great. Defeat is great. Poverty is great. Misconception is great. You'll remember that it was Emerson who says in Self-Reliance, to be great is to be misunderstood, right? And so he's following in that self-reliant strand. And then he finishes with a very interesting rhetorical question. And he uses again the pronoun we, which I think he learned how to use from his study of the Declaration of Independence. Did we think victory great? So it is. Dash. But now it seems to me, again, back to our construction from Song of Myself, passage 6, seems to me the beautiful uncut here. When it cannot be helped, and that's a key line, I think, that defeat is great, and that death and dismay are great. By great here, what does he mean? Well, it means useful, right? He means useful. It doesn't mean great as in yay, yippee. And I think this is an important distinction to make. Whitman is not arguing in his theodicy that we should be happy with those things, defeat and death and dismay. But we have to see their value, and if we can't see their value, we're never going to understand the true definition of liberty. Well, what is this now? How are we going to bring it down to a close? What are we going to say about this at 2a? Well, I think he's arguing that all pain, all suffering, all failure is in fact propedeutic. It's useful in some way. And of course he's arguing that the cause of liberty never dies. It cannot die because there will always be somebody who's ready to stand up to positions and people of power and say, no, no, absolutely not. Stand up to the infidel, if you will, to use the language of the poem. At 2b, I love the defiant voice that Whitman is utilizing here. Okay? It is interesting, as we pointed out. Notice in this poem what's missing. There's no use of cameredo. There's no use of comrade here. There's rather brother and sister. And notice, again, why is the word revolutionary not actually in the poem? And then notice the title, to a foiled revolution. A, not the. And notice, that is to say, are we talking about one or are we talking about many? It's clear that he is talking to us in the plural. Now, I've mentioned at 3a, I've mentioned already Thoreau's Civil Disobedience of 1849, of course, Marx Engels and their Communist Manifesto of 1848, and we've referenced the Declaration of Independence, and it's such an important and precious document for Whitman that his use of the word we is there. But I want to take us to the great Emily Dickinson and a poem that I've completely explicated elsewhere at learnstrong.net. But do you remember this beautiful poem, Success is Counted Sweetest, from the 27th of April, 1864? That's when it was published. Do you remember what she says? Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. Not one of all the purple hosts who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear of victory as he, defeated, dying, on whose forbidden ear the distant strains of triumph burst, agonized and clear. I'm always amazed at the ways in which Emily and Walt so easily can be brought together. And of course, that's her rendition, that's our understanding that it isn't the victorious who understand success. It's those, and it's all of us, isn't it, who have encountered failure and then have to live with that failure, with being foiled, if you will. Finally, at 3b, it is a few questions here. Is it true that the spirit of liberty never dies? Okay, because, for example, we think about the horrors of what's happening now in North Korea and elsewhere. Is it true that sooner or later liberty will always triumph? How do you see that? And what about the failed revolutions that we don't want to see resurrected? Like, for example, the Confederacy of the South. And how would this poem be read by somebody who was thoroughly convinced that their rebel Confederacy was in fact the right thing for them to do? Would they take some kind of succor or some kind of support from a poem like this? Finally, to own this personally, when was a time in your life when defeat and dismay were actually great, useful for you? And is your study of Leaves of Grass helping you to come to this theodicy of learning to ask why this happened for me? Thank you.